super excited to speak with Melissa Tasse today. Melissa holds a Ph.D. in Pharmacology from the University of Texas Medical Branch with a focus on neuroscience. As the words opioid epidemic started showing up in newspaper headlines, Melissa felt obligated to understand more about the issues surrounding this epidemic. In delving deeper, she realized that she must do all she could to educate parents about the link between vaping, underage drinking, and drug use, including the danger from over-the-counter drugs found in medicine cabinets across the country. Melissa founded the Honeybee Foundation in 2016 with a mission to educate parents to the science of the developing brain, its vulnerability to substance use, and provide tools and techniques that can prevent substance use disorder. Welcome, Melissa.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
We all read the headlines about the opioid epidemic, but I feel that most of us as parents feel that this happens far from home and our kids are protected. How do you convince parents to take this issue seriously and educate themselves and ultimately their children?
Wow, Marcy, that's like the $1 million question when you're up against industries, pharmaceutical industries, marijuana industries, vaping industries that are putting messages out there for profit. And then, I'm just a person, trying to educate parents. How do I reach parents, when they have all of that money to spend on advertising? I just said to myself, how do we ultimately prevent this? Like, what is the very beginning points at what we can do to prevent it? And, I just backed up. And it's truly, I think, starts with parents. Mm-hmm. And the science around understanding addiction, the science of understanding how the teenage brain, the adolescent brain develops, it's all relatively new. Like, we're going to say within the past 20 years, which for science is really, really new. But with the science, right now, we really understand what's happening. So first, we're going to have a little neuroscience 101 about the developing brain, because I think that's important to understand. So the brain develops, so you are pregnant, you have a baby, and the brain develops from, it has tons of neurons, but then they start to form perfect connections. It's called pruning, like a tree, but it starts in the back. The development starts in the back of your head and it moves towards your front throughout your life. And your brain is mostly developed by the age of 25. The first thing they start to do is like learn to sit up. They learn to crawl, they learn to walk, and that's the back of their brain and their gross motor skills, right? Then they start sitting in a chair and eating, and they're using their fingers to pick up the little cereal, the Cheerios, and then they're getting their fine motor skills, right? And again, we're still going from the back towards the front. The next thing is they start talking, right? And you don't really see, they don't start talking when they're 6 weeks old, right? That's when they're starting to sit up. So the brain is can kind of really only focus through development on one really big thing at a time. Right. And so it slowly develops. And when you get to adolescence, this is when everything kind of goes wackadoodle. And this is like the really important part of understanding brain development in teenagers and the vulnerability to developing an addiction. So everything about your body, everything about the brain is about survival of the species, right? And that's how come the baby has to learn to sit up. The baby has to learn to eat, and slowly. But by the time you get to adolescence, if you think of a caveman, right, adolescence is when you're going to start having babies and relationships and sexual relationships. And the brain then is wired for, we're in something called the limbic system. So this is what's developing. And it's for survival of the species. So when you have a drink of water because you're thirsty and you drink the water, you're like, oh, that was so good. There's some dopamine release in your limbic system that makes you feel kind of good, that says, hey, you need to drink water. When you have a significant other, a partner, someone you fall in love with, right? That releases a lot of dopamine because, again, it's for survival of the species. They want you, your brain wants you to find a mate, have babies to perpetuate the species. Like anything that you do during adolescence that makes you feel good is all because of the dopamine, right? And that's just teaching your brain to keep doing those things because that's what's going to allow the human race to keep going. So that's really like the basics of it. What happens in adolescence, because that's the part of the brain, right? And if those of us who've had teenagers, it's about instant gratification, and anything that makes them happy, right, is what they drift towards. And unfortunately, if during that same time, so the limbic system is that whole dopamine reward system, and any substance of abuse, anything that causes addiction, nicotine, marijuana, alcohol, anything, opioids, amphetamines, methamphetamines, like any of those benzodiazepines, like all of these things affect that limbic pathway. And if during adolescence, during that developing time, they're going to get, so whatever I said about, like, let's say you had your first kiss or your first boyfriend or your first girlfriend, whatever it is, and you feel that, whoa, that is amazing feeling. Unfortunately, these substances that are addictive, it's like 3, 4, 5 times the dopamine release. Right. And so that's how come the adolescent brain is so vulnerable, is because if they start experimenting with drugs, right, then their brain is wired for this reinforcement of the dopamine release. And with addiction, what happens is the more that you do use substances that affect this pathway, your brain changes. The neurons in your brain change, the receptors change, the pathways change, such that instead of realizing, oh, you need food, oh, you need water, it thinks that you actually need the drug for survival. And so it replaces what we really need, because the drug is so powerful. But what is good about the science is now that we can understand that, like, we've learned a lot more about how you can prevent it. Right. And what can we do to try to protect our children? What can we do? What children are more possibly vulnerable? Right. You can never know 100% like this child, that child. Right. And that's the scary part. But now we've certainly gotten to a point where we can try to prevent it as parents. And obviously we never know what child, there are some people who have used substances in high school or, middle school, whatever. They went on to life. They're fine. They've never developed an addiction. Some people, they do develop an addiction. So there are people who are definitely going to be a little bit more vulnerable, like people who don't have a great home life, whose parents may be abusive emotionally, physically. They're not around a lot. Maybe they work out of the home a lot and they don't really have a lot of parental guidance. People who suffer from depression, people who suffer from anxiety, people that are in the LGBTQ community are also much more vulnerable and much more susceptible. People with disabilities, people who suffer from ADHD, all of these people they have more risk factors. And the more that you have, the more vulnerable you are. People who are vulnerable start using substances. It makes them feel really good, right? Someone with anxiety is like, oh, right, I have a drink, I'm more social, I'm less anxious, and it feels good. Or they're around friends and they feel loved because like, oh, all of my friends are doing it. They feel more accepted, right? And they just start using it more and more. And then what happens with those brain changes, part of it is this whole addiction cycle. Like that limbic part of your brain is just this circular, a neuron connects to another neuron to another, and it's all just one big cycle. And what happens is with some of these brain changes, the brain starts to crave the drug because it thinks that's what it needs to survive. And that happens early on. But what typically happens is, someone starts using during childhood, and then it develops. Maybe they don't have an addiction per se as a teenager, maybe even early university student, but throughout their life, it just progressively gets worse and worse and worse. But over 90% of all addictions start during adolescence. Wow. So adolescence is really the key time of when it starts. And it's also correlated to the younger you are of your first use of any of these substances, the more likely you are to develop an addiction. So as a parent and as, you know, as a scientist, right? Like ideally, we don't want any child to use any substance until, you know, 21 or 25. There's data, right, that shows if you wait as long as possible, it's very rare that you're going to start an addiction. But also we're realistic, right? We know, again, the brain, these adolescents, right? They're trying stuff. They're risk takers. They're pushing boundaries, you know, and people will use. And so my message to parents is not, don't let your kids use. I mean, ideally, that's what we want. It's just try to do as much as you can to delay as long as possible their first, you know, their age of when they first start using.
Right. Okay. So then that's some of the tips I would love to find out from you. Like what should parents be looking for? How do parents have these conversations with kids to delay their use of these substances? Coming from in the field that you're in, what are some of the things that you tell parents?
So just like you have the risk factors, right? There are also protective factors. So a lot of the protective factors are, you know, finding out what your child is interested in. Are they interested in tennis? Are they interested in music? Are they interested in dance, art? And trying to fulfill as much dopamine release as you can with things that make them happy. And to understand, like, if your child does suffer from anxiety, depression, right, get the appropriate treatment as best you can to make them less susceptible. And then as far as like parenting tools, like to technically prevent substance use, you yourself become knowledgeable about these substances, right? There's a lot of misinformation out there from these companies that are trying to sell these things, right? And kids are on the internet, we know that, and they easily access those articles that make it sound like, oh, it's no big deal. Oh, I can control it. Oh, so-and-so said this. Oh, it's really not that harmful. And parents also receive that same information, but you need to go to the right sources to find out what is the, you know, the actual data. Educate yourself about the substances, and have conversations, you know, and try to make it casual and try not to make it be the talk. I'm going to have one talk with you at the age of 12 about drugs, right? It's an ongoing, you know, conversation. It's so easy these days. Like in music, there are so many references to substance use in music. And it's easy to be, you know, in the car or at home and you're listening to their music to talk about, you know, to bring it up and talk about it. Yeah. In movies, in TV, you know, just sort of casual conversation, asking questions, listening to them so that you know what they think they know. And then you don't have to always know the answer. You can listen, you can hear, go back, do some research, ask around, you know, and then, you know, have the conversation another time. The hard part of giving them freedom and then also knowing what they're up to. You need to know where they're going. Are they going to a party? Is the parent there? How does that parent feel about the use of substances? And, you know, sometimes it's having to say no to your child, like, no, I do not want you to go there. The parents will not be there. Or no, I don't want you to go there because I know that their parents will be providing alcohol. You know, keeping in touch with your children and knowing where they're going. And, you know, you decide together, like, what makes sense. It's also modeling behavior. You know, being the role model. And when you go to dinner, right, sometimes don't always have a glass of wine and sometimes have a glass of wine and be very purposeful and even, you know, say to your child, yeah, tonight I'm not going to have a glass of wine, or tonight, yeah, right, I've already had 2 glasses this week. You know, that's all I want to have this week. Right. And just showing them, like, when you drink, it's not to be excessive, right? It's responsible use. So it's modeling behavior. Like, what we have to do is show our kids that when we've had a bad day, right, how we cope with it is not using substances, right? Like, we go for a walk, we go to our room, we have a bath, we go work out, we cook dinner, like whatever it is, but like, and again, be purposeful and tell your child, like, I had like the worst day today. It was awful. I need 30 minutes to myself, right? I need to go for a walk or whatever, right? And not using a glass of scotch or a glass of wine as your coping mechanism.
Those are great points. What do you say to parents that say, I grew up, I was a teenager, I drank and I smoked and I hung out with my friends and I dabbled in this or that. I turned out fine. And I think your point is also some people are going to be just fine and some are not. And 100%. Do you really want to take that gamble with your kids? Like, you were lucky. Right. You came through okay. Maybe there's stuff that, you know, they haven't really given thought to that maybe it did influence their life. They're just not being thoughtful to. But, you know, it could have gone a completely different direction.
It is the gamble. And when it comes to kids, right? So first of all, what most people don't even realize that there's data. I'm not just making this up because to me, it's shocking. Right. 12% of the adult population suffers from a substance use disorder. Specifically, let's talk about marijuana. Like, that's the thing, that's, evolving, it's very prevalent now with the legalization. 1 in 5 kids who use marijuana regularly will develop an addiction, right? And so as a parent, if you know and allow your child to use marijuana, right, you are taking a gamble. It's Russian roulette, 1 in 5.
Yeah.
Could be your child. It may not be your child.
And then my other question was, some people say, we don't have alcoholics in my family, we're going to be fine. Or, I guess that's the same thing. That's the gamble.
Genetics can certainly play a role, right? So just like, diabetes, type 2 diabetes that you get later in life, right? Genetics play a role. Like, there's that gene there, right? And if you think about diabetes, the gene is there, but it's not active until you stop exercising, you eat too much fat, you eat too many sweets, you gain a lot of weight, and you don't do anything about it. And then that gene gets turned on.
Right.
And then now you have type 2 diabetes, and you can't go back and unswitch that switch. Right. You can't turn off that gene. It has now been activated. And that's the same thing with addiction and genetics.
Vaping. This is something obviously that's taking, it's become very mainstream. And I personally have friends that allow their teens to vape and they just dismiss it and it's not a big deal. And it's vaping, it's better than drugs. And, but again, you're saying they're all one and the same. It turns on, it gives them that dopamine rush, right? And it's slippery slope.
It is. And by the way, most teens who are vaping are also, again, I'm all evidence-based. I'm not just like throwing things out there. The data shows that if someone is vaping, they're more likely to also be using alcohol, also be using marijuana. Right. As an adolescent. Like, it's not, one substance, like, I'm vaping, I'm using alcohol, I'm using marijuana. No, they all cross over and they all coexist. So if they're vaping, they're more likely to also be using other substances, which compounds the problem, right? Because you now have multiple substances. This is what makes it very difficult. What I do, it's up to parents to want to learn it. And those parents to which you refer that are like, I got this, whatever, I know I'm doing the best thing, right? They're the ones that don't necessarily show up or don't go to learn the information. Yeah. And that's what I find to be so challenging and why I'm so appreciative that through your format, right, that you're sharing this information, right? Hopefully we reach at least one other person who steps back and says, wait a second, there's more to this than I thought.
Yeah, that's what it's all about, right? It's just educating, sharing information. Most people just don't even know where to start, or they're just overwhelmed in life. Life is crazy and this and that. And teenagers are not easy to parent as it is. And this is just a whole nother layer of, difficult conversations and policing them and checking on them. And it already is a lot with them. Melissa, we talked a little bit about, the dangers of substance abuse. And one of the points I love that you made was finding other ways to release that dopamine rush in kids that are healthy. That was just so interesting. And you had some great ideas. Maybe you could share them again.
So, right. What I mentioned before, very basic, things, figure out what they're interested in, let them pursue their interests. Right. Other things that are protective and release dopamine are getting in, volunteering with charity organizations. Mm-hmm. That helps on, that's also a protective factor, and it also causes dopamine release, right? And I know a lot of kids are probably very reluctant. They're like, oh, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do that. But if they start doing it and they see like, oh, wow, I'm making a difference, I'm making an impact, and it gives them empathy for these people. But that also causes a dopamine release, the giving back to other people. Working at an animal shelter, I mean, getting a job, right? Anything that builds resiliency. So, this topic I like because, yes, it's about prevention of substance use, but it really is a piece of like everything else that we're talking about in this world about, mental health and resiliency in children, right? These are the things that help prevent substance use or addiction in kids. And it's like developing that resiliency. So it really is important, although, I outline how we need to keep a check on our kids and, pay attention to their social media accounts, right? You have to balance that, you don't want to be the helicopter parent because that's actually a risk factor, right? So you need to allow your children to do things that you feel are safe, mm-hmm. To take risks, to get that dopamine release, skiing, skateboarding, definitely social interaction. You want them to be with friends, right? You have to be careful, right? That's the hard part with being a parent. Being social, having relationships is really important in teenage years. It's just, that's the catch-22, right? Because the social interaction can lead to using of substances, and then that like snowballs because they're happy to be with friends and they use substances that make them happy too. And that's where the parental monitoring has to sort of take place. And through your communication with your child, like I said, it's not a talk, it's casual conversations and being open, mm-hmm. to hearing what they have to say and creating the type of relationship with your child that they will share with you.
I mean, it's never too late to start. I think ideally,
100%.
Anybody that's watching that has younger kids, I think that's when you make the biggest long-term difference, and you can help
100%
stave off the teenage, seeking and searching for things that fill them up. Because if you can keep them really busy when they're young and introduce them to things that they can develop those passions to, whether it's mountain biking or skiing or playing guitar or whatever the activity is, that they actually really love it, they can fill that bucket without needing to turn to other things. And then they can find a social group within that niche, whatever niche that 100%. Is. And it's definitely harder when they're teenagers, if they've kind of been left to their own devices and not really found a groove for something they love. But it's never too late to start. There's lots of things you can introduce them to and do with them. I think that's another really important thing. What do you tell parents that have found drugs in their kid's bedroom or alcohol or the vape pen?
First of all, take a deep breath. And it can be frightening, scary, alarming. Don't immediately confront them, right? Take a step back. And again, go to some resources, because this is not like where in our parent training manual were we taught, oh, what are we supposed to say to our child when we find something, right? And for sure, if you confront them in a confrontational manner, right, it's not going to go well. One of my favorite resources for parents is an organization called the Partnership to End Addiction. Their website, the URL is drugfree.org, and they have information for parents, are trying to prevent substance use, parents who just found something. How do you have that conversation? What do you do? How do you talk about it? All the way up to parents who sadly have learned, or their children have very, very deep addictions. There are great resources on the website, but what they also offer is trained parents who've been in their exact same situation, parents who have found a device, parents who've had children who developed addictions, and they are trained parent volunteers that you can chat with, you can text, you can call a hotline and have actual conversations of, okay, what do I do?
Right. Perfect. That's great. So I guess the bottom line is you should take it seriously, whether you're finding a vape pen or you're finding a rolled marijuana joint. Don't let it go. Don't overreact. Do some research. Go to your child prepared. And I think a lot of kids are pretty logical. Like they're interested in knowing, and don't assume that it's going to be a battle. Maybe they just need to be educated in it a little bit more. Start early, of course, but if you haven't yet, there's, you still can do that and hopefully turn it around, but take it seriously.
Yeah, 100% take it seriously, because as I said, the earlier a child starts, the more likely they are to develop an addiction. Also, the earlier you as a parent notice if they start using, the earlier you can intervene in the process of developing of an addiction, let's say, the better off the outcome. Right. So you don't want to find one vape pen and like hope, oh, that was just one. And then you start finding more and more pods, vape pods here, vape pods there, right? It's to intervene early for the best outcome, right? So this is a treatable disease. It's preventable. And if your child starts using, even develops an addiction, like it's preventable and it's treatable. There's always something you can do. That's my other message to parents. I don't want this just to be this terrifying topic. There's definitely something that you can do.
You can do. And I guess, yeah, because the neural pathways in the brain are going to ebb and flow. And we do know more now about the brain with the brain's more plastic and pliable than we ever thought. So you can help them. You can help turn around. It's just going to be more of a challenge the older that they are and the longer that they've been doing it.
100%.
Right. Oh, okay. Well, Melissa, thank you so much. This has been so informative. The work you're doing is incredible. And I know you're changing lives and most likely saving lives. So keep up the great work. And I'm so glad we had a chance to talk about all this.
Thank you.